Hello and welcome to the President's Podcast right here on the record with the Ohio Senate. The views the news excludes. I'm John Fortney, the Director of Communication with the Senate Republican Caucus, the Majority Caucus, and the Ohio Senate. Great to have back on the program post-November Election Day and the defeat of Issue 1, Ohio Senate President Matt Huffman.
Good to be back, John.
Big night.
Yeah. It's always the next couple days after an election, especially a presidential election, everyone's, you wake up and you start walking around saying, okay, there's other things to think about now besides an election. So you got to get back to work.
It really was a David versus Goliath moment. $37 million on the pro-Issue 1 campaign, far less than that. $37 million of the Issue 1 campaign, more than 99% of it coming from out-of-state, secretly funded dark money groups. But I thought Jim Province, the State House Bureau Chief, been there probably 30 years for the Toledo Blade, put it best of all the election night coverage. And he said the following, and I'll get your reaction. He said the campaign behind the proposed reform of how Ohio redraws political districts had more than $37 million in its pockets from across the country. It had big labor and the Democratic, Libertarian, and Green parties behind it, the endorsement of every major newspaper in the state, and a near record of petition signatures. It was fronted by 2 Ohio Supreme Court justices, and it failed on Tuesday.
Yeah, I think that, if you pull the lens all the way back here, there have been a number of redistricting changes that have been placed before the voters since the late 1960s, some by Republican-sponsored groups, some by Democratic-sponsored groups. All of those have failed, including this one. There have been 3 redistricting initiatives, one in 1969, one in 2015, one in 2018, and when both parties supported them, they passed. And I think the answer here is that if it's a reasonable proposal that most people, both parties support, even if, like the last 2, Republicans weren't totally happy and Democrats weren't happy, then probably the voters are going to support it. So this is just another in probably about a 70-year history, 75-year history of how these things go.
Also in the same story, and this goes to the whole narrative of gerrymandering, really it was a rebuke of the whole idea that the state is gerrymandered from the voters, because not only was Issue 1 defeated by 8 points, but all the Republican candidates for the Ohio Supreme Court were elected. So you'll have a 6-1 majority on the Supreme Court. And in the same Toledo Blade story, Jim Province writes, voters not only defeated Issue 1, they gave Republicans a clean sweep of 3 Ohio Supreme Court seats on the ballot. That sets the stage for a 6-1 GOP court that will decide how other recently passed constitutional amendments will be implemented. In other words, if gerrymandering really was an issue, really resonated with the voters, they would be voting much more for the activist judges that were part of the narrow 4-3 O'Connor majority.
Yeah, I think there's a fair argument to be made. Remember, voters make up their mind for a lot of different reasons. I think, frankly, when it comes to races like the Supreme Court, the candidates matter. Republicans had 3 great candidates who were running. I also think that, generally speaking, folks they know the word gerrymandering, they know it's bad, but exactly what is, gerrymandering, that's sort of in the eye of the beholder. I mean, this would require gerrymandering, this Issue 1, require gerrymandering in the Constitution specifically, that it must happen. And, that's why the ballot board said we have to say what it is. And, of course, the Supreme Court upheld that.
Yeah, and even on election night, from the Issue 1 side and the League of Women Voters in Ohio, or as I like to say, the League of Liberal Misinformation. This is a story from Jesse Balmert in the Dispatch. And it says, but Issue 1 backers say Ohio voters were duped by GOP-crafted ballot language and deceptive campaigning against their measure. Quote, a lot of Ohioans were tricked by the ballot language, said Jen Miller, the executive director of the League of Women Voters. We know that they really wanted to end gerrymandering and take mapping away from politicians. Maureen O'Connor said, the former Chief Justice, of course, who was the face of the campaign, said, quote, the people that voted no thought that they were voting to end gerrymandering because of the manipulated language on the ballot, which I I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but I was a little surprised that they went all in on that because the Ohio Supreme Court said, no, that is an accurate depiction of what that 36-page, 13,000-word amendment really does.
Yeah, and I, you have, millions of voters. They don't all vote the same way for the same reason. Someone sent me a picture of the Franklin County elections board, or when they went in to vote. This wasn't so in Allen County, at least when I went to vote early, and there was this huge poster size of the amendment. Now, a lot of people are simply going to look at that and say, I'm not going to read all of that. I'm not sure what it says, but I'm not voting for it. And remember, typically constitutions are not large amendments like this. We all know what our U.S. Constitution says, and when it says freedom of speech, we go from there. We don't have to detail what freedom of speech is in the Constitution. Of course, we've had lots of litigation over several hundred years about that. But I think voters looked at this and said, look, for those who took the time to examine it, and they saw that millions of Ohioans are excluded from serving on the commission, that you couldn't talk to the commission members outside a meeting, that you couldn't go in and say commission members violated the law or the Constitution. You couldn't go to court and enforce that. They were immune. Yeah, essentially they were immune. They couldn't be removed except by themselves. They could decide what they were paid. And they, for those who went that deep into it, they say, well, I'm never going to support something like that. And then, of course, we did have the experience in Michigan, and we saw what happened. And so I think there probably was some significant pushback from the African-American community. Even though some leaders publicly said one thing, there were other leaders who were against it. I suppose if somebody wanted to do a deep dive in it, you could see in what precincts did it not do as well. For example, maybe Kamala Harris did well, but there were the yes side didn't do as well. Frankly, I doubt if anybody does that because, we all move on and move on to the next thing.
I got the sense several weeks ago that they thought they might be in trouble because of how well Senator Reynolds' news conference. Senator Reynolds has been on the podcast, one of our members, a Republican from Canal, Winchester in Ohio. She was joined by former state representative John Barnes, a Democrat from Cleveland that you served with, along with Rebecca Zatella, who was the former chair of Michigan's so-called independent redistricting panel. And they really laid it on the line in the news conference, and we followed up with a podcast with them about Barnes saying this disenfranchises minority neighborhoods, minority voters, specifically the black vote. And also, when you had Sherry Gay Dagnogo, who's a former state rep in Michigan, saying they cut Detroit up 22 times. And proportionality wasn't even the primary criteria of how Michigan runs things. Nobody wants their districts to be stretched out like that, especially if you're thinking about undermining the voice of the voter that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. 10 years ago, when I authored with others, including Vern Sykes, the 2014 or 15 GA change and congressional change, really one of the great clause was don't divide up my community, don't divide my city or my community multiple times. It's disenfranchising us, it's making us weaker. And that was really a hallmark of that reform, is to make sure that couldn't be done anymore. Under the previous iterations, it could be. So we have a very really restrictive line drawing rules in Ohio, unlike any place else in the country. But you have to get rid of, you have to divide communities in order to obtain the result of that the folks in Washington, D.C. who were sponsoring this want to obtain.
Right. It was very interesting when all of the major editorial boards really turned a blind eye to where all the funding was coming from, the 1630 fund, the Tides Fund out of California, and on. And as I said, more than 99% of its funds were from out-of-state dark money sources. And even the Toledo Blade editorial board a few weeks ago said, well, there is an element of gerrymandering within issue 1, but they went ahead and endorsed it. So here's the most recent editorial that came out on Wednesday. The final paragraph, I think, shows a lot. Maybe it was even a wake-up call to many of the legacy newspapers around Ohio. The board said, clearly a majority of Ohio voters were uncomfortable with specifying the outcome of elections by the way the districts are drawn in a way that would artificially enhance Democratic representation in the General Assembly. Some would and did say that is the actual definition of gerrymandering. I think they finally got it. That clearly proportionality, and you're starting out with a fixed percentage based on how many districts went Republican or how many races went Republican, how many went Democrat over a decade or over a 6-year look back. That's called gerrymandering. That's not competitive.
Yeah, well, you can, gerrymandering is drawing districts to obtain a particular result, and in particular, a political result. Now, you can draw districts so that certain voters do better, certain political parties, but that's the one that we're trying to avoid is in the sort of classic opposition to gerrymandering. But the problem is in the state of Ohio, you're going to have to violate all those other rules that the voters voted for by over 70%. You're going to have to throw all of those out the window in order to obtain a political result. Now, remember, too, that most voters are not a registered Republican or Democrat. They may vote more Republican, but they're unaffiliated, as we call them in Ohio. Some call independent. So it sort of says we're going to forget about everything except political results. Well, that's the purest form of gerrymandering. And I think that everybody is against that. Probably if both sides had spent the same amount of money, their campaign ran for a year, ours ran for about 3 months, then this probably would have been a 60-40 or 65-35. It was just that difficult to get a message out when you're getting outspent 4.5 to 1.
Well, also in your statement on election night, and you hit some of the points in your comments about there were only 3 times that redistricting measures passed in the last 50 years, and they passed in a bipartisan manner. And you said that Ohioans will only support constitutional reforms if they are truly bipartisan. One of the interesting things about that is we like to say that candidates' campaigns and issues matter. And issue 1 said that competitiveness need not be considered as part of the map drawing. Right. So then why even have a campaign? Why even have a race? But wasn't it interesting that as part of your commentary on your release on Tuesday night, you brought up and made the point that the Redistricting Commission last fall produced a unanimous bipartisan vote last fall for General Assembly maps that will last for the remainder of the decade. And oh, by the way, because there was bipartisan negotiations, good faith negotiations, Democrats were able to pick up a couple seats.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not too proud of that as a Republican president of the Senate, but that part of the negotiation of these things. Now, those were still seats that, in theory, we could have won, and we had good candidates, and we ran hard, and those candidates tried to get their message out. The point about this is that the point about the system we have in place is it requires both sides to compromise and talk to each other. Now, the majority is always going to have the benefit because in the end they have the votes to get what they want, but they're restricted because they can't divide up communities. They can't create elongated districts. They can't do all of the things that they could formerly do. That's why voters like this in 2015. And it's the whole basis of our constitutional system generally. Our U.S. Constitution requires majority rule but minority rights. And when that system was being created 250 years ago, we're not going to have a king and all the rich people in the House of Lords and Parliament make the decisions. Everybody gets to vote, but the majority is going to make, but you can't take certain things away from everybody else. And that's the basis of this reform. And it worked. Once the 4 people who are on the Supreme Court got out of the way and let it work, and even though they keep talking about, well, the maps were overthrown a number of times, I should clarify for people who want some detail. They say 7 times. Let me clear that up for folks. There were 4 decisions on the General Assembly map and 3 on the congressional map. The challenge to the congressional map went to the United States Supreme Court. They can read about it. It's Matt Huffman, Ohio Senate President versus Neiman, I think. U.S. Supreme Court decided in North Carolina, this is the way this should be. They sent the congressional map case, the one that has my name on it, back to the Ohio Supreme Court.
Vacated.
Yes, and said, we're going to vacate your decision. You decide this case based on these rules that we are giving you. Well, what happened then was the side who's challenged, the side who's paying for this whole $37 million, they dismissed the case. And the reason was, well, we don't think there should be litigation. There's been too much litigation about this. Well, no, they knew they were going to lose in the Ohio Supreme Court. So you want to say 7, let's take those 3 out, okay? So these 3 Democrats and Chief Justice O'Connor made these decisions. But in each of those cases where they said you have to draw the map like this, even though the Constitution said Supreme Court can't draw a map, they were backing into it, we did what they said. And they looked at it and said, well, here's some new rules, and they're not supposed to be doing that. So, ultimately, and you can read the federal court decision where they said use this map, and the federal judge is questioning whether the Ohio Supreme Court really has the authority to do what they're doing. That's why we had to have this special election. So when the system was allowed to work in 2023, we had a unanimous bipartisan vote.
Yeah, page 51 of the 3-judge federal panel said that the O'Connor narrow majority had been using, quote, criteria not easily found in the Ohio Constitution, right. Meaning that it wasn't found in there and you're making it up as you go along to try to draw a map by just backing into it. There is going to be some more map drawing, though, come next year. On the congressional map under Article 19. Article 11 deals with the maps for the House and Senate in the General Assembly. The congressional map was a 4-year map, I believe, and so for 26, you have to start that process in 25. It's a little different process because it starts in the legislature. The legislature gets the first shot at it. If that doesn't work and you don't meet the bipartisan percentages that you need for a 10-year map or for a map for the rest of the decade, then it goes to the redistricting commission, and then I think back to the General Assembly. What should we expect in that process?
Well, we're going to use the census data from the 2021 census. In September, there'll be a bill introduced in probably in both houses to talk about what the map ultimately will look at. We'll try to negotiate with the other side. If we do, then we'll get there's a certain vote count. If that doesn't happen, the redistricting commission can take a shot at it. But it'll be 5 Republicans, 2 Democrats. The map could come out at that point. And if it doesn't, then it goes back to for another 30 days back to the General Assembly where they could pass a map. But it only has to be a simple majority at that point. So the concept, when this was all drafted, the congressional part passed in 2018, is there's going to be a lot of vetting, and there's going to be a lot of conversation and a lot of different eyes on this thing, whereas in prior years, which both sides were complaining about, Republicans before 2000, Democrats after 2000, which is about the time that Republicans started winning statewide offices, the concept here is lots of people get eyes on it. There's lots of examination. It doesn't just show up one day and it's voted and comes out. Maybe I'm being a bit Pollyannish about it, but when you all sit down here and you work out the details and you say this is what, and we all agree on it, and then 3 years later everybody's filing lawsuits about what we just agreed about, it's a problem. And I will tell you too, John, that it seems like no matter what we do for negotiation or trying to work these things out, the people who are deciding to put these things on the ballot aren't the people in the room. These are the people spending $35 or $40 million from Washington. They don't care what a bunch of people in Ohio worked out. And that's, I guess, part of the sort of discouraging part of trying to to get some consensus on.
Well, they can blow up not only good faith negotiations, but when you have $40 million just to throw away, you can fund a petition drive. You can make another revolving door attack and get yourself enshrined in the Ohio Constitution, or at least make a significant attempt that has to be defended, like issue 1 was.
Yeah, and it's a, I don't, I guess the pessimist in me thinks, well, Mark Elias and Eric Holder and Barack Obama will be back for another try in a few years. And if that happens, we're going to have the same discussion we had yesterday.
But fortunately, though, in the springtime, we were able, the General Assembly, along with the governor, were able to pass the law that outlaws foreign contributions to ballot initiatives, aligning the law that you already couldn't take foreign contributions for a candidate campaign. And then, of course, the Elias law firm sued on that, but that was also ruled that, no, this law is constitutional. So maybe that will help.
Yeah, I think that, again, maybe I'm being too much of a pessimist. I don't think that these folks in Washington are discouraged by this. It's like we just need to approach it from a different place. We'll wait a few years. We'll get spokesmen and supposed interest groups stirred up, and we'll try to find the right year to put it on. Now, yeah, it would be great if we had absolutely no influence. That's why we from foreign dollars. That's why we passed it, and we'll have to make sure that the law is enforced appropriately.
One of the interesting things that happened on election night, of course, issue 1 wasn't the only thing on the ballot, the presidential race, obviously. Yeah. And President Trump cleared Ohio by 10 points. Issue 1 was defeated by 8. Bernie Moreno was elected. And with the U.S. Senate race going to Moreno, it does then provide an opening for the governor to make a nomination. And on Wednesday, I was receiving some messages about, does President Huffman, is he going to be the next U.S. Senator? Does he have any interest in being a U.S. Senator because of the opening? So I'll just go ahead and ask you, does that interest you at all, being a U.S. Senator?
Absolutely not. And I don't have any interest in it. I'm not going to be the next U.S. Senator or any future U.S. Senator. And to be clear, this is Governor DeWine's decision. And so, that's going to be up to me. He hasn't asked me my opinion, and I don't think, I make lots of appointments, none of that magnitude. The governor does not call me and say, here's what I'd like for you to do. I think there's a potential that I can be Speaker of the House in January, and I think that's a more important job than being in a state like Ohio. Ohio's, of course, one of the biggest, wealthiest states. We're often the leader in policy making, and that's not only a more important job, it's a better job. And so, if you simply said, take one of these two, clearly I would rather be Speaker of the Ohio House, and I'm on a better path to do that anyway. So, but I'm sure Governor DeWine, there'll be a lot of great candidates. I'm sure Governor DeWine will make the right choice.
Before I leave the whole redistricting issue, I know Governor DeWine was very helpful in coming out early in the process against State Issue 1, pointing out the danger of having Issue 1 and that policy founded in proportionality. He also did talk a little bit about he liked the Iowa plan, and maybe that was a point of discussion for a revision, an upgrade, something on down the line to put before the voters that would be an amendment to the current process. Where do you stand on having that conversation, especially when you already have to go and redraw a congressional map next year?
Yeah, well, going back to some of the prior comments, I think in a process like this, there are always ways to improve it, not only just through the Constitution, but even statutorily. We could sit down and say, here's how this is going to go. Of course, we'd have to do that in a way that didn't violate the Constitution. But, as I said, the Republicans have tried by themselves to put stuff on the ballot, failed. Democrats did it, failed. But the 3 times that it's passed, it's been in a bipartisan way. So, making sure, I actually talked about this in 2012 when I was on the Constitutional Modernization Commission. This is one of the things that we talked about, as well as other proposals. So I think, constitutions should be living things, but not because judges are making up new meanings to words that are in them, but because the population and modern society says things have to change. I think there are things that need to change in the U.S. Constitution, certainly in the Ohio Constitution, and if we can make these processes for both congressional and General Assembly better, I'm all for it.
Final thought from you about maybe just the political landscape of how it has changed over the last 4 years, call it. Obviously, 2020 was a trying time for the country with COVID and trying to handle that type of disaster. 4 years of Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and then President Trump really hurdles over the Electoral College, and at this point, I believe, was still winning the popular vote. And you look at, even as we've liked to say on this program, that up until the most recent districts were passed in the Senate, there were 15 districts that leaned Democrat, of which there were 8 Republicans that won those districts. When you have a Republican presidential candidate and a Republican Party doing so well that resonates to a lot of what were blue-collar voters back in the 80s that were reliably Democrat, what do you think was the watershed moment that really changed the political environment for the Republican Party in Ohio?
Well, I'm not sure that everybody is saying the same thing. I guess I want to have 2 comments about that. The first is, I think the watershed moment was Joe Biden getting elected in 2020 and having Kamala Harris as his vice president. And you were on a path where you had a president of that age potentially not being able to run in a second term. And Joe Biden didn't have any intention of not running. But when, I tend to think the first debate was planned by some folks who are trying to get him out. But then they were then in a position of, well, who's the candidate going to be? And the powers that be said the vice president. Well, that candidate didn't do very well in the primaries. In short, for a variety of reasons, she just wasn't a very good candidate. And when that's the process that you use to your candidate, you're going to have big problems. And history will show that, that I think Hubert Humphrey was a good candidate in 1968. But he didn't start running for president until well into the year, sooner than Vice President Harris did. So I think that was one problem. I think the second issue was that, and I think, if you look at the polls generally, it will show that the border is out of control. We're seeing that in communities all across the United States. And when the Biden administration decided what we're going to do in this COVID epidemic is to release $6 trillion into the economy, I'm sure the mindset was, when these people get these checks, we're going to be rewarded in 2024. Well, by the time you got there and you had inflation where it was, that's what people are thinking about at the time, not a check they got 2.5 years ago. So, and the inability to act on those 2 issues, I think, was probably the difference. You have to say that the Democrat candidate is going to get 45% of the vote, and the Republican candidate is going to get 45% of the vote. And it's the other 10% of the vote who aren't dedicated to either party that think about these things. Those are the people. Now, certainly there are Republicans who voted for Harris and Democrats who voted for Trump, but that extra 10%, that's where it is. And if you nationally, you're going to have a president, looks like he's going to win the popular vote by 6%. And frankly, if the Republican candidate is winning by 6%, the popular vote is really much more, because the Republican candidate is not campaigning in New York and California. California is 1/6 the population. Well, you go campaign in California, you're going to pick up a lot of votes because campaigns matter, but you're not spending any money there. Now, if you wanted to go there so you could get another 3 or 4%, well, you're not in Michigan and Pennsylvania and other places. So the popular vote is interesting. The fact that a presidential candidate who's a Republican is going to win by 5%, that's a lot. So I think it really shows the mood the country's in.
One final thought. Also, I did see some analysis on some of the 24-hour networks that really faced their comeuppance. They had to eat some crow, and there was a message out there about, look at how the Republican and the Trump campaign really embraced other media, not legacy media. Trump was on Joe Rogan, right? All the popular podcasts that have 30 million viewers, which is more than all of the other networks combined. The golden age, broadcast television that I used to work in, newspapers, and then that whole collective narrative was rejected by the voters, much like it was rejected with issue 1 in Ohio. What do you think about messaging, conveying your platform, trying to communicate with constituents? You used to have to push it through the legacy media pipeline. That's not as important anymore.
Yeah, I would sort of comment on that from two angles. Most people in their daily lives have a group of, if you're lucky, 15, 20, 50 people, your family, your close friends, your work associates, and those are the people you talk to all of the time. And that's where you get your information. That's often where your own attitudes are. Sometimes you disagree with family members, you have fights about it. But, because you can't be friends and have a relationship with more than that number of people. Malcolm Gladwell says it's 100. You can only know 150 people at one time, and maybe he's right, and he has some scientific studies about that. And so, but often that you and that group of people will get their source of information from one place. Everybody gets the newspaper. Everybody watch Walter Cronkite. Everybody watches this. And so, but now that group of you and your 149 closest associates now have many places to get information. And so, some would say, well, there's not a sense of community. I think communities are as strong. It's just that it's not manifested in the same way. And there is it's fragmented, I think, where you're getting information. I think it's a good thing because people can say, well, that's not what this guy's telling me. And as you get people more engaged, maybe they get more mad. We talk about that. But you also get people who have more information, because you may love Joe Rogan, but you can say, I disagree with Joe Rogan about that, and I got the feeling that Joe Rogan would be okay with that,
Yeah, we like to call it the views the news excludes for a reason, right?
Yeah, right.
Ohio Senate President Matt Huffman, congratulations on the defeat of State Issue 1.
Yeah.
Thanks for your time as always, and thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.